The English Colonies. This module is going to be divided into two sections, the first being Virginia and New England states, and the second being over the Carolinas, Middle Colonies, and Georgia. When Queen Elizabeth, who never married, died in 1603 without a child of her own, James VI of Scotland, her distant cousin, became King James I of England. While Elizabeth had ruled through constitutional authority, James ominously claimed to govern by divine right, which meant he answered only to God. James I confronted a divided Church of England, with the reform-minded Puritans in one camp and the Anglican establishment, headed by archbishops and bishops in the other. In 17th century England, those who criticized or abandoned the Anglican Church were called dissenters. The Puritans were dissenters who believed that the Church of England needed further purifying. They demanded that all papist rituals be eliminated. This meant no holy water, no organ music, no elegant robes or jeweled gold crosses, no worship of saints or kneeling for communion, and certainly no tyrannical bishops and archbishops. The Puritans wanted to simplify religion to its basics, people worshiping God in plain, self-governing congregations without all the formal trappings of Catholic and Anglican ceremonies and wealth. They had hoped the new king would support their efforts, but James I instead sought to banish them from England after converting to Catholicism. Between the time of James's inauguration as king and his son Charles I, England saw a mass amount of upheaval during religious conflicts and war. Eventually, a dramatic transfer of power would accumulate into the Glorious Revolution. During these eventful years, all but one English North American colony, Georgia, was founded. From the onset, English colonization differed significantly from the Spanish pattern, in which all aspects of colonial life were regulated by the government. The English government treated its original American colonies much like it dealt with neighboring Ireland. The Irish had been conquered by the English during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. England, therefore, extended its control over Catholic Irish through the planting of new Protestant settlements in Ireland called plantations. By confiscating Irish lands and repopulating them with English and Scottish Protestants, the government sought to reduce the influence of Roman Catholicism and smother any religious nationalism in conquered Ireland. In time, the English would impose their rule and religion upon Native Americans as they had imposed upon the Irish. Now, England envied the riches taken from the New World by Spain, especially the enormous amount of gold and silver. However, the English colonies in America were quite different from the Spanish colonies. Spanish settlements were royal expeditions. Much of the wealth and land the Spanish accumulated in America became the property of the monarch who funded the conquistadors. In contrast, English colonization in the Americas was led by two different people, those seeking freedom from religious persecution, both Protestant and Catholics, and those seeking land and wealth. In addition, English colonies in America were private business ventures or collective religious experiments rather than government enterprises, and they were expensive. Few individuals were wealthy enough to finance a colony over a long period of time. Due to the expensiveness of colonization, the Englishmen interested in colonization banded together to share the financial risks of starting colonies in the American wilderness. Investors purchased shares of stock to form joint stock companies. That way, large amounts of money could be raised, and if the colony failed, no single investor would suffer the whole loss. If a colony succeeded, the profits would be shared among the investors. Yet while the English monarchy did not fund the colonial expeditions, they did grant the royal charters or legal authorization needed to launch them. The joint stock companies represented the most important organizational innovation of the age of exploration, and they provided the first instruments of English colonization in America. The English government and individual investors had two primary goals for their American colonies. The first, to provide valuable raw materials such as timber for shipbuilding, tobacco for smoking, and fur pelts for hats and coats. and the second being to develop a thriving consumer market for English manufactured goods. To populate the colonies, the English encouraged social rebels, including convicts, religious dissenters, and the homeless and landless to migrate to America, thereby reducing social and economic tensions at home. By far the most powerful enticement to colonists was the offer of land and the promise of a better way of life, what we came to be called the American dream. Land, plentiful and cheap, was English America's miraculous treasure. Once it was taken from Native Americans, of course. What virtually all the diverse immigrants shared was the courage to risk everything for a new life of adventure in America. During the late 16th century, England experienced a population explosion that outstripped its economy's ability to support the surplus of landless workers. Many of these poor laborers would find their way to America. An additional social strain from the English poor was the enclosure of farmlands on which peasants had lived and worked for generations. As trade in woolen products grew, landlords decided to enclose farmlands and evict the farm workers in favor of raising sheep. The enclosure movement of the 16th century, coupled with the rising population, generated the great number of beggars and vagrants who wandered across England during the late 16th century and gained immortality in the line from the Mother Goose Tale, "Hark, hark, the dogs do bark, the beggars have come to town." The problem caused by this uprooted peasant populations provided a compelling reason to send many of them abroad to colonies in America and the Caribbean. A little about the population of English settlements. The English settlements were more compact than New Spain. They were closer together. The lands that were populated, had less Native American populations, who were less numerous and less wealthy, a little bit more scattered. Just to show you how many English there would become, is the contrast between them, the Spanish, French, and Dutch. By 1660, there was 58,000 colonists in New England and along the Chesapeake Bay. Compared that to the 3,000 in New France and 5,000 in Dutch New Netherland. By 1750, English colonists outnumbered the French nearly 20 to 1, that being 1.3 million versus 70,000, and in New Spain there was only 20,000. Now we'll go ahead and start with Virginia. In 1606, King James I chartered a joint stock enterprise called the Virginia Company. It was owned by merchant investors seeking to profit from the gold and silver they had hoped to find in America. King James also gave the Virginia Company a spiritual mission by ordering the settlers to take the Christian religion to the Indians, who lived in darkness and miserable ignorance. In 1607, the Virginia Company sent to America 3 tiny ships carrying about 100 men and boys. In May, after 5 storm-tossed months at sea, they reached the Chesapeake Bay, which extended 200 miles from north to south along present-day states of Virginia and Maryland. To avoid Spanish raiding, the English colonists chose to settle about 40 miles inland along a large river with a northwest bend. They called the river the James in honor of the Catholic king, and named their first settlement James Fort, later renamed Jamestown. Unfortunately for James Fort, many of the people who were brought there were either poor townsmen unfamiliar with farming or gentlemen adventurers who despised manual labor. Not a very good start. Also, the climate during summer was hot and humid. Now, the Virginia colonists who came had high expectations for the land that they were entering. The expectations were of rich, fertile land, overflowing with gold, friendly Indians, and of course, an easy living. However, in reality, it was much different. The immigrants found a low-lying island surrounded by boggy salt marshes. Within the salt marshes, then, was malaria-infested mosquitoes, causing mass disease. On top of that, within the first year, they also experienced drought and starvation. The colonists struggled to find enough food to eat. They also experienced violence with the Native Americans among themselves as well. Every colonist fell ill within 1 year of arrival, and quite a few of them died. Now, within the Virginia area was that of the Powhatan Confederation. The leaders of the company expected the Native Americans to submit to the authority of the colonists. However, they were very much mistaken. The 14,000 Indians living along the Virginia coast were dominated by the Powhatan Confederation, or the Powhatan Confederacy. Powhatan, as the English called him, was the supreme chief of several hundred villages, organized into 30 chiefdoms in eastern Virginia. At the time, the Powhatan Confederacy may have been the most powerful group of native peoples along the entire Atlantic coast. Their culture focused on raising corn, and they lived in oval-shaped houses framed with bent saplings and covered with bark or mats. Their walled villages included forts, buildings for storing corn, and temples. They also lived in family clusters with very specific gender roles and divisions of labor. Men were required to hunt, fish, and fight, while women and children gardened, made baskets and pottery, cooked, and as the men said, everything else. There was specific and very strict guidance into who did what, to the point that men would refuse to do women's work, even if they were done with what they had to do. Now, a little bit about Powhatan. Powhatan was an imposing individual and lived in an even imposing lodge on the York River, not far from Jamestown. He was protected by 40 bodyguards and supported 100 wives. Powhatan was as much an imperialist as the Spanish and the English. He forced the chieftains of rival peoples he had conquered to give him corn. Upon learning of the English settlement at Jamestown, he planned to impose his will on the strangers as well. When Powhatan happened upon a group of Englishmen stealing their corn, he killed all of the 17 while they were stuffing their mouths full of corn. The inexperienced colonists found a match for Chief Powhatan in John Smith, a canny, iron-willed 27-year-old mercenary who arrived the next year with more colonists. The Virginia Company, impressed by Smith's exploits in foreign wars, had appointed him a member of the council to manage the new colony in America. It was a wise decision. In the first 9 months, the original 105 settlers, only 38 survived the first 9 months. At one point, Smith said that all their food was gone. All help abandoned, each hour expecting the fury of the savages. After recognizing their desperate extremity, the Powhatans brought corn to the rescue of the starving settlers. Afterwards, Smith imposed strict military discipline and forced all to work long days in the field. He also bargained effectively with the Indians. Through his dictatorial efforts, Jamestown survived, but it was not easy. When no gold or silver was discovered in Jamestown, the Virginia Company shifted its money-making efforts to the sale of land, which would raise the value as the colony grew in population. The company recruited hundreds of new investors and settlers with promise that Virginia could make them rich. Unfortunately, the influx of settlers nearly overwhelmed the struggling colony. During the winter of 1609 and 1610, the colony's food supply again ran out, and most of the English colonists died of disease or starvation. The desperate settlers consumed their horses, cats, and dogs, and then after all of them had gone, rats and mice. A few even ate their leather shoes and boots and the starch of their shirt collars. One hungry man, it is said, killed, salted, and ate his pregnant wife. Horrified by such cannibalism, his fellow colonists tortured and executed him. But unfortunately, the cannibalism continued as the desperation worsened. So great was the problems that the savages who slew and buried him, so the people who actually killed him, actually dug him up and ate him themselves. This is not the only form or the only time that Jamestown experienced the issues of cannibalism, it appeared. In June 1610, as the surviving colonists prepared to abandon Jamestown and return to England, a new governor, Lord Delaware, arrived with 3 ships and 150 men. They established new settlements upstream at Henrico, which was Richmond, and 2 more downstream near the mouth of Jamestown. This would be a critical turning point for the colony. After Lord Delaware returned to England in 1611, Sir Thomas Gates took charge of the Virginia settlements and imposed a strict system of laws. Such penalties for running away included shooting, hanging, or burning. When a man was caught stealing oatmeal, the authorities thrust a long needle through his tongue, chained him to a tree, and let him starve to death as a grisly example to the community. Gates also ordered the colonists to attend church services on Thursdays and Sundays. Religion now became a staple, and religious uniformity became an instrument of public policy and civic duty in colonial Virginia. Over the next few years, Jamestown colony limped along until at last the settlers found a profitable crop in tobacco. The plant had been grown on Caribbean islands for years, and smoking had become a popular habit in Europe. In 1612, settlers began growing Virginia tobacco for export to England. There was so much, and just an example, and by 1620, the Virginia colony shipped 50,000 pounds each year to England. By 1670, Virginia and Maryland exported 15 million pounds annually. This new crop meant they needed new labor, and the new form of labor was indentured servants and slaves. To support their deepening investments in tobacco lands, planters purchased indentured servants, colonists to exchange several years of labor for the cost of passage to America and the eventual grant of land, thus increasing the flow of immigrant workers to the colony. Indentured servitude became the primary source of laborers in English America during the colonial period. Of the 5,000 English immigrants to America from 1610 to 1775, some 350,000 came as indentured servants, most of them penniless young men and boys that the English government was eager to be rid of. In 1630, the gender ratio in Virginia was 6 men to every woman. By the 1650s, it had dropped to 3 to 1. Not all indentured servants came to the colonies voluntarily. Many homeless children in London were kidnapped and sold into servitude in America. In addition, Parliament in 1717 declared that convicts could avoid prison or the hangman by relocating to the colonies, and some 30,000 made their way to the New World. Newspaper in American ports announced the arrival of indentured servants for sale. One advertisement noted a shipment of healthy indented men and women servants, a variety of tradesmen, good farmers, stout laborers, who indentured will be disposed of on reasonable terms for cash. Buyers of workers preferred the strongest young men and the most attractive women. Those who were sick or older proved harder to sell, and often they were added to a sale as a bonus. Some middlemen would buy the whole shipment of servants and then load them on a wagon to sell to outlying communities. While most men labored on farms and plantations, young indentured women tended to work as household servants, learning the skills of spinning, sewing, cooking, and cleaning. Once in America, servants were provided food and a bed, but life was harsh and their rights were limited. Masters could sell or loan, or rent, servants to others without their permission. Marriage required the master's permission. Masters could also whip servants or chain them in iron collars and extend their length of service as penalty for bad behavior or for running away. Indentured was almost like being a slave. However, the differences were these. Indentured servants, unlike slaves, could file a complaint of abuse with local courts, and it did not last for a lifetime. Usually, it only lasted 4 to 7 years. Once an individual was freed, they could claim a freeman's due, which meant they could get tools, clothing, food, and on occasion a tract of land. Just because you were a former servant did not mean that that was going to be your station forever. Some former servants did very well. In 1629, for example, 7 members of the Virginian legislature were former indentured servants, and 15 served in the Maryland Assembly in 1637. Such opportunities were much less common in England or Europe. Now, Pocahontas. Many of you are aware of Pocahontas and through the Disney movie. However, in real life, the story was completely different. Pocahontas was the favored daughter of Chief Powhatan. In 1607, the famous incident of her saving John Smith. At 11 years old, she saved John Smith from being executed by the Powhatans for trespassing. In exchange for muskets, hatchets, beads, and trinkets, the Powhatans let John Smith live and go. Pocahontas and John Smith were not lovers, just good friends. Later on, Pocahontas would be kidnapped to blackmail her father. However, in a surprise turn, she decided to join the English instead. She was converted to Christianity and baptized the name Rebecca. Once she was baptized, after a little while, she fell in love with John Rolfe, an Englishman. They married and had a son. In 1616, they moved their infant son Thomas to London. However, after a few short months, she contracted lung disease and died at the age of 20. Now, the years between 1618 and 1624 for the Virginia Company exhibited a lot of ups and downs. In 1618, Sir Edwin Sandys, a prominent member of Parliament, became the head of the Virginia Company and created a new policy to attract more colonists to Virginia when he announced the Head Right or Land Grant Program. Any male English colonist who brought a share in the company and could pay for passage to Virginia could have 50 acres upon arrival and 50 more for each servant he brought along. The Virginia Company also promised that the settlers could have all the rights of Englishmen. That included an elected legislature to advise the colonial government. They argued that every man would be more willing to obey laws to which he had yielded his consent. This was a critical development, for the English had long enjoyed the broadest civil liberties and the least intrusive government in Europe. Now the colonists in Virginia were to have the same rights. By 1619, the settlement had outgrown Jamesport and was formally renamed Jamestown. In the same year, a ship of 90 young women came. Men rushed to claim them as their wives by providing 125 pounds of tobacco to cover the cost of each transatlantic passage. Also in 1619, a Dutch ship called the White Lion stopped at Jamestown and unloaded 20 Negroes, the first enslaved Africans known to have reached the English America. This began a humane system that would grow rapidly while spurring dramatic economic growth, sowing moral corruption, and generating horrific suffering for African Americans. By 1624, some 14,000 English men, women, and children had migrated to Jamestown, although only 1,132 had survived or stayed. That same year, in 1624, the English court dissolved the struggling Virginia Company, and the weak, miserable Virginians became royal colonies. The settlers were now free to own property and start businesses. Their governors, however, would thereafter be appointed by the king. Sir William Berkeley, who arrived as royal governor in 1642, presided over the colony's rapid growth for the most of 35 years. The relentless stream of new settlers into Virginia exerted constant pressure on Indian lands and created growing social tensions among whites. The largest planters in the colonies sought to live like the wealthy English gentlemen who owned huge estates in the English countryside. In Virginia, these men acquired the most fertile lands along the coasts and rivers, compelling freed servants to become farm workers, or forcing them inland in order to gain their own farms. In either case, the poorest Virginians found themselves at a disadvantage. By 1676, one-fourth of the free white men were landless. They roamed the countryside, squatting on private property, working at odd jobs, poaching game, and struggling to survive. The simmering tensions among the landless colonists contributed to the tangled events that came to be called Bacon's Rebellion. The discontent erupted when a squabble over hogs between a white planter and Native Americans on the Potomac River led to the murder of the planter's herdsman, and in return, retaliation by frontier vigilantes, who killed some 24 Indians. When 5 native chieftains were later murdered, enraged Indians took revenge on the frontier settlements. Scattered attacks continued southward to the James River, where Nathaniel Bacon's overseer was killed. In 1676, when Governor Berkeley refused to take action against the Indian raiders, Bacon defied the government's authority by assuming command of a rebel group of more than 1,000 men, determined to terrorize the protected and Darling Indians. Bacon said he would kill all the Indians in Virginia and promised to free any servant and slave who joined him. Bacon's rebellion quickly became a battle of landless servants, small farmers, and even some slaves, against Virginia's wealthiest planters and political leaders. Bacon's ruthless assaults against peaceful Indians and his greed for power and land sparked his conflict with the governing authorities and the planter elites. For his part, Governor Berkeley opposed Bacon's plan to destroy the Indians, not because he liked them, but because he didn't want warfare to disrupt the profitable deerskin trade the colonists enjoyed with Native Americans. Bacon, whose ragtag army had now dwindled to a few hundred, issued a Declaration of the People of Virginia, accusing Berkeley of corruption and attempted to take the governor into custody. Berkeley's forces resisted, and Bacon's men burned Jamestown in frustration. Bacon, however, could not celebrate the victory long. He fell ill and died a month later. With Bacon dead, the rebellion gradually disintegrated. Governor Berkeley had 23 of the rebels hanged. For such severity, the king denounced him as a fool and recalled Berkeley to England, where he died within a year. Moving on to Plymouth. Plymouth was the first permanent English settlement in New England, and it was established by separatists who were forced to leave England because of their refusal to worship in Anglican churches. The separatist saints demanded that each congregation govern itself rather than be governed by a bureaucracy of bishops and archbishops. Separatists had first gathered in Scrooby, an English village, only to be forced out, resettled in the English town of Boston, before many of them left England for Holland, where over time they worried their children were becoming Dutch. In September 1620, about 100 women, men, and children, some of whom were called strangers rather than separatists because they were not a part of the religious group, crammed aboard the tiny Mayflower, headed across the Atlantic bound for Virginia. A storm, however, blew the ship off course to Cape Cod, just south of what became Boston, Massachusetts. Since they were outside the jurisdiction of any organized government, the 41 separatists on board the Mayflower signed the Mayflower Compact, a covenant or group contract to form a church. The civic government grew out of the church government, and the members of each were identical. The signers of the Mayflower Compact at first met as the General Court of Plymouth Plantations, like a town meeting, which chose the governor and his assistants. Other property owners were later admitted as members or freemen, but only church members were eligible to join the General Court. Eventually, as the colony grew, General Court became the legislative body of elected representatives from the various towns. Now the Plymouth colonists settled in the deserted Wampanoag Indian village that had been devastated by smallpox. The Pilgrims named their hill colony Plymouth after the English port from which they had embarked. They too experienced a difficult starving period, as had the earlier Jamestown colony. During the first winter, half the Pilgrims died, including 13 of the 18 married women. Only the discovery of stored Indian corn buried underneath enabled the colony to survive. Jumping to the Plymouth Bay Colony. The Plymouth Colony was soon overshadowed by its much larger neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was also intended to be a wholly Protestant commonwealth. The Massachusetts Bay Puritans, however, differed from the Pilgrims and Anglicans in important ways. They wanted to purify the Church of England from within, not separate from them. They were called Congregationalists because their churches were self-governing rather than ruled by an Anglican bishop in distant England. Their congregations limited membership to visible saints, those who could demonstrate receipt of their gifts of God's grace. In 1629, King Charles I gave the royal charter to the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was planted in New England the following year. It consisted of a group of Calvinist Puritans led by John Winthrop. Winthrop's group took the royal charter with them, thereby transferring government authority from London to Massachusetts, where they hoped to govern themselves. Winthrop was a virtual dictator, a strong leader who believed that the government should enforce religious belief and ensure social stability. He and the Puritans had no toleration for other religious views in New England. Catholics, Anglicans, Quakers, and Baptists were punished, imprisoned, banished, and sometimes executed. Even Puritans who spoke out against religious or political policies were quickly condemned. An example of this is Anne Hutchinson, the very strong-willed, intelligent wife of a prominent merchant, raised 13 children, and hosted meetings in her Boston home to discuss sermons. However, soon, the discussions turned into larger gatherings at which Hutchinson shared her strong feelings about religious matters. According to one participant, she preached better gospel than any blackcoat or male minister. She was blessed with vast biblical knowledge and quick wit. She claimed to know which of her neighbors had been truly saved and which were damned, which included ministers. She quickly was viewed as a dangerous woman. Soon after that, pregnant, Anne Hutchinson was hauled in front of an all-male general court in 1637. She was charged with undermining the kingdom of Christ. Within the court, she sparred with the male individuals, step by step, Bible verse by Bible verse. Soon, she was seen as stepping out of her place. Anne Hutchinson was then convicted after claiming direct revelations from God, which was deemed blasphemous, and banished. After her banishment, she, her children, and 60 followers moved to Providence, Rhode Island. However, she quickly grew sick and had a stillborn baby. Those back in Massachusetts Bay Colony called this God's punishment and served her right for the way that she was acting. The death of her husband in 1642, however, would have a very lasting effect. She would never be able to recover. She then moved to New Amsterdam. In 1643, she, along with 6 of her children, were then massacred by Indians. The representative government. The transfer of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's royal charter, whereby an English trading company evolved into a provisional government, was a unique venture in colonization. Unlike Old England, New England had no powerful lords or bishops, kings or queens. Massachusetts' General Court, wherein power rested under the royal charter, consisted of all shareholders. These were property owners who were also called freemen. At first, the freemen had no power except to choose assistants, who in turn elected the governor and deputy governor. In 1634, however, the freemen turned themselves into the General Court with 2 or 3 deputies to represent each town. A final stage in the democratization of the Massachusetts Bay government came in 1644. When the General Court organized itself like the English Parliament, with a House of Assistants corresponding roughly with the House of Lords and the House of Deputies corresponding to the House of Commons, all decisions had to be ratified by a majority of each house. The Puritans who had fled religious persecution ensured that their liberties in America were spelled out and protected. Over time, membership in the Puritan Church replaced the purchase of stock as the means of becoming a freeman or voter in Massachusetts Bay. More than an accident than design, the Massachusetts Bay Colony became the staging area for other New England colonies created by people dissatisfied with the Puritan control. Young Roger Williams had arrived in the colony from England in 1631. However, soon after arrival, certain problems were held. He was a purist of Puritans, a separatist. He criticized Puritans in Massachusetts colony for not completely cutting ties to what he called was the whorish Church of England. When John Winthrop cherished strict governmental and clerical authority, Williams stubbornly championed individual liberty and criticized the way the Indians were being shoved aside. Then combative Williams posed a radical question. If one's salvation depends solely upon God's grace, as John Calvin had argued, why bother to have churches at all? Why not give individuals the right to worship God in their own way? In Williams' view, true Puritanism required complete separation of church and state and freedom from all coercion in matters of faith. Such dangerous opinions, led by Williams, was cut down by Governor Winthrop and the General Court. They banished Williams back to England, but before they could ship him back, he slipped away during a blizzard and found shelter among the Native Americans. In 1636, he brought land from them and established the town he named Providence at the head of the Narragansett Bay. This was the first permanent settlement in Rhode Island and the first in America to allow complete freedom of religion. It was also the most democratic of colonies, granting full citizenship voted by the majority of the population. The last three. This is going to be Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Maine. In 1636, the Reverend Thomas Hooker led 3 church congregations from Massachusetts Bay to Connecticut, where they organized a self-governing colony. In 1639, the Connecticut General Court adopted the Fundamental Orders, a series of laws that provided for a Christian commonwealth like that of Massachusetts, except that voting was not limited to church members. The Connecticut Constitution specified that congregational churches would be the colony's official religion. The governor was commanded to rule according to the word of God. To the north, most of what is now the states of New Hampshire and Maine were granted in 1622 to 2 individuals. These 2 individuals were Sir Ferdinando Jorge and Captain John Mason. In 1629, the land was divided. Mason was granted New Hampshire, and Jorge the northern part, which would become Maine. Lawsuits over New Hampshire and Maine were frequent during the 1640s all the way to the 1691. In the early 1640s, Massachusetts took over New Hampshire and extended authority to parts of Maine in the 1650s. In 1678, New Hampshire judges ruled against Massachusetts and was granted their own charter. In 1679, New Hampshire became a royal colony, while Maine was still in control of Massachusetts. Finally, in 1691, the new Massachusetts charter incorporated Maine.